Hey everyone, Kevin P. McAuliffe here for lowpost.com, and I'm back again with lesson 2 in our Scratch Dailies tutorial series. And in this lesson, we're talking system settings, user settings, and project settings. It's important to get in and not only set up your system settings and your user settings correctly so that you make sure that you don't run into any hiccups along the way, but setting up your project settings is not only important right off the bat, but there's also some great bells and whistles that you can get in and set to help make your overall Scratch workflow as smooth as possible. Alright, as you can see, we are in the Scratch interface, and this is version 9.1 of Scratch. Now, believe it or not, this is actually the second time that I've recorded this tutorial, because when I originally recorded it, I got in and I talked about the system settings and the user settings right off the bat. And then it occurred to me that once I got into the actual project creation and talking about the project, that it's actually more important, I think, to talk about that first. And then once you see how we're going to get in, set up our project, and get in and get a little bit of a look at Scratch, then we're going to talk about our system settings and our user settings, because then we can take what we've learned to that point and apply it to those concepts there. So let's talk about creating a new project. I'm going to come down and I'm going to select New. Now by default, when the Create New Project window comes up, everything is grayed out. So we're going to call this Scratch Dailies Lesson 2. Now, as soon as I say create, everything's going to become active. Now, there's a few things I want to focus on in here. The first thing I want to focus on is our project paths. Now, you'll see that we have the media, render, and cache locations. Now, render and cache, fairly self-explanatory. Where is that going to send render files and where is that going to send cache files to? Now, by default, probably not the greatest idea to have it sent to your local hard drive, which I happen to have here. Obviously, depending on how much work you're going to be doing, I normally like to have that going to an external hard drive. But what I want to do right now is just talk about media. Now, you might be thinking, well, what does that exactly mean, media? Does that mean that I need to put all of my media into that folder for Scratch to see where it is? And the answer to that is no. Scratch can work with media one of two ways, relative and absolute. Now, what I normally like to do when getting in and setting media location is that when I work, I'll normally have a folder called Scratch Footage. And inside of that folder, I'll have all of my projects divided up into folders. And then inside of those will be subfolders that will have all the media, and then subfolders inside of there, and subfolders inside of there, etc., etc., etc. Now, all I'm going to do is I'm going to point Scratch to the topmost folder in that chain. Okay? Chances are, like I said, it'll be called Scratch Media or something like that. Now, the reason I'm going to do that is that if I end up getting in and reorganizing media, adjusting folder names, folder hierarchy, things like that, Scratch is going to easily be able to get in and to relink all of the footage because it's looking at that folder hierarchy, that media project path, as opposed to looking at an absolute path, meaning, oh, I happen to have this folder on another drive somewhere, I'm going to point to that folder directly to bring footage in, and then somebody takes that folder and moves it to another drive that Scratch is going to have no idea where it is because it's an absolute path. I'm not telling Scratch, hey, everything's in this folder, just go and find it. I'm going to have to tell Scratch where it is. So keep that in mind. You're normally going to want to set that folder to be the topmost folder in your media chain. Now, getting in talking about image format settings, this can, again, vary based on what you're doing. In most cases, if you're doing a dailies workflow, chances are you're going to be setting dailies up in a 1920 by 1080, 2398, potentially 24 frame per second project. This is the default settings. You can, of course, get in and change this at any time. Now, again, because most of my dailies workflow is 1080p 2398, I'm going to leave everything the way that it is. And one thing that I really like is that I have the ability to now get in and not only set how we're going to start things, but set how we're going to end them as well. I can actually get in and apply a default output template right here before we even get started. Now you're probably thinking, Kev, well, aren't you sort of, jumping the gun a little bit? Why? If I know that I'm going to be working for the next 4 months just on doing Avid dailies, why wouldn't I make my life as easy as possible? This way is just one last thing that I have to set before getting in and starting my overall workflow. Now, let's just talk a little bit about clip metadata before we go on, because as you've heard me talk in the first lesson, metadata is exceptionally important. But what's also cool about metadata is that you can get in and really enter any metadata you want, again, at any step of the process. So let's create our own custom metadata input window. What we're going to do is we're going to call this, and I'm just going to add a new item. We're just going to call this Where Are My Clips At? Okay. And what I want this piece of metadata to do is to, every time I bring a clip in, we're going to assign this piece of metadata of where my clip's at to be the actual source path. Now keep in mind, I could leave the value as blank and go in and enter that information manually, but why would I do that if I can have Scratch populate that information for me? So let's just say my project is now ready to go and I'm simply going to say OK. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to enter my project and let's just import some media. I'm just going to come to my Scratch Dailies. I'm just going to grab the video clips and I'm just going to bring them all in here. I'm just going to say open. I'll just say yes so that we can have the timeline match the frame rate of the clips, which is fine for the purposes of what we're doing. And I'm going to take them and drop them into these slots here. What I'm going to do is just select one of the clips. Now remember, if we want to get in, take a look at our metadata, I'm just going to tap on the right side of the screen and you'll see that we have metadata selected. Now that metadata that I entered was called where's my clip at? So I'm just going to take my bar, drag it all the way down to the bottom and take a guess at what's now been put in here. There's where's my clip at, or where my clip's at, and there's the actual location of the clips that I imported from my hard drive. Now again, keep in mind, like I said, I could have left that blank, much like these are blank here, and come in and enter the production info operator or the director or the company and enter all that information in here manual if I want to. But in certain situations, it's always a good idea to have Scratch put that information in for you. All right, now we're talking about what's going on at the right side of the screen, and I teased this a little bit in the last lesson. You'll notice that we have some stuff happening on the left side of the screen as well. Now you'll notice that right now we are in our project hierarchy. And you'll notice that we have something called group and something called timeline. Now, inside of Scratch, for your Dailies workflow, you can work one of a few ways. You could conceivably take a camera card or multiple camera cards, take all that media, drop it into one massive timeline and do your workflow like that. Would I recommend that? Probably not. Strictly from an organizational standpoint, especially if you're on set doing this. You're going to want to have things as organized as possible. Now, you can get in and have multiple timelines in a project. Timelines can have multiple layers, and you can also have multiple groups of timelines in any given Scratch project at any time. So you'll see that I have a timeline right now called appropriately enough timeline. So what I'm going to do is just edit that, and I'm just going to call this Kev's timeline. Okay. And what I could do, I'll call it my Tim line here. Let's actually call that the proper thing here, timeline, perfect. And I can just call this Kevin's group 1. Or actually, let's call it this. We're going to call this card 1. Okay. And actually, let's just rename that. I'm just going to call this tape 1. Okay, what I now have the ability to do at any time is to come in and to add a new timeline. I could call this tape 2. And you see where I'm going with this. At any time now I could say, well, you know what? We're done with card 1. What I'd now like to do is to bring in card 2. Let's create a new group. We'll call it card 2. Okay, and in timeline 1, we'll just call this again tape. Let's just call this tape 3 just for argument's sake. And what I can now do is I can just import a clip here. Let me just bring in, I'll just bring in one clip here, this one. I'll say open, I'll drop it in here, and you'll notice that these other timelines are blank, except the first one where I'd entered those 4 shots. This one's blank because I haven't entered any media, but this one here will now have the new media associated with that card. So groups and timelines are all about organization. I highly recommend that what you do, especially if you're doing a Dailies workflow, is give every group the day name, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. Each card you get gets its own timeline. This then makes it a very easy way, if again you're on set, director comes over and says, I'd really like to see, from that first card, the 5th and 6th shots that we had. Boom, no problem. There's card 1, there's tape 1, boom, there's the 4th shot. Let me hit play. There's exactly what it looks like. It's all about organization. Okay, keep that in mind. You're always going to hear me talk about organization and metadata. Those are the 2 things that you can always know will go hand in hand when I'm talking about Dailies workflow. All right. Now, one last thing that I do just want to double check here is I'm just going to come back to my tape 1, and I'm going to come down over here to the render module. Now, you will remember when we did set up our project, we set up our default output template to be our Avid Dailies workflow, which is how everything is set up now. Now, how do I know this? Well, if I take a look right over here at my output, it is set up to be a DNX HD 36 codec output, which I know is an Avid Media Composer codec. Now, I'm not going to go in depth into this window because I have an entire lesson dedicated to outputting at the end of this course. But what I am going to do before we hop in and talk about our settings here is I'm going to come back to the construct window. I still have edit selected. And I'm just going to delete this group and I'm going to delete this tape right here. I'm just going to come down and delete those because I am going to need some media to show you a couple things when talking about our settings. So let's come down here and let's close our project. And let's first navigate to our system settings. I'm going to come to the general window. And inside the general window, something that I do want to point out, two things actually. One is the system paths located right here. You'll see users, projects, and settings. Now, again, I did mention before that depending on the type of system you're working on, you are going to probably want to set these to be on an external drive. By default, mine are set on an external drive, which is fine for what I'm doing. You'll notice, though, that my projects are set to my external drive because I keep all my Avid projects there, my Premiere projects there. So I like to keep my Scratch projects there just to keep myself organized. And again, if I ever have to pull the plug on that drive and take it with me somewhere, I always like having access to all of my projects in one location. Now, if you're going to be working on set and you have an SDI card in your computer and you're going to want to utilize it for outputting to an external client monitor, you are going to want to make sure that you have the proper SDI drivers installed in your system. And they've made it very easy for you to track them down. I'm simply going to click on that option. I'm going to be brought to the recommended drivers for Scratch, specifically for 9.1 or 9.0. You'll see there's AJA, Bluefish, Blackmagic, Red Rocket X, and Red Rocket. Again, very handy to have access to that right here from within the system settings window. All right, let's move on. Now, if you happen to be working with a panel like I do at the office, this is where you can come into your panel setup. In my case, I would select the tangent wave or wave 2. Simply enable it, and as soon as I do, you'll see the entire panel come alive, ready to work with inside of Scratch. All right, let's talk about notes for just a second here. Now, when talking about notes, a lot of people will refer to notes as something along the lines of a marker. Now, I don't like to refer to notes as markers. I actually prefer to refer to them as sticky notes because that's more what I consider them to be. Imagine that you have yellow, green, blue, red, and purple sticky notes in front of you, and you're going to have different shots, different versions of shots that have been color corrected, graded, had LUTs applied to them. And you're going to be leaving notes for not only yourself, but for people that you're working with to exactly what all of this is, why you've done what you've done, etc., etc. Now you'll notice that we have a color and a default annotation as well as a quick key assigned to each one of these notes. So how is this actually going to work in practicality? Well, let's just say OK, and I'm going to come back into my Lesson 2, we're going to enter the project, and I'm going to pick one of these shots. We'll pick the first shot here. Now I'm going to use the shortcut of Shift and F1 on the keyboard. So I'm going to hit Shift and F1, and you'll notice as soon as I do, what's happened is that a note has been applied to this shot, as well as the default annotation of attention. Now what's important to keep in mind is that applying the note the way that we've just done it inside of the construct window is going to apply that note to the very first frame of the shot. Now I'm going to show you in just a second how we can apply the note anywhere in the shot and then see it much like how you add a marker in another nonlinear editing application. Now that does beg the question, how do I actually get access to that note? Well, if we come over to the right side of the screen and we tap to call out our metadata, you'll notice that along with the metadata here, we have our notes. Now, as soon as I click on notes, you'll now see the note appears front and center. So I can just type in big bold letters, this is a note. And as soon as I update that, I can click anywhere else in the interface. You'll notice that it's updated down here on this shot. Well, you do have the ability to add more than one note. What I'm going to do here is hit Shift F2, F3, F4, F5, F6. You kind of get the idea of how this works. And you can see the dividers that have been added for all the different notes. I think I've got about 9 notes in there. Now, if I wanted to know for sure how many notes I had in there, all I have to do is simply head back to notes. And if you take a look up here, you'll see this is note 1 of 8. And I can click through all of the different notes by simply just clicking on the arrow keys. And once I get to the end here, I can also quickly remove them as well to get everything right back to the way that we had it before. All right, now before we jump back into our system settings, I want to circle back just to talk about something that we had mentioned earlier, and that is when you apply notes inside of the construct window, that note is being applied to frame 1 of your shot. However, there may be situations where you want to use notes like markers to identify a problem with a shot, something that somebody else like a colorist or an editor might need to take note of. So let's get in, let's do that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch over to the edit module here, and we're on our second shot, and I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to mark when our cowboy goes out of frame. Now I'm not going to do this any different than what we had done before. I'm going to use Shift and F1 to add that note. You'll see as soon as I add it, the note will appear over here on this version of our shot. Now I'm just going to jump down to about here. I'm just going to add another one. Let's just go Shift F6 so I can add a red note as well. Now I've added these 2 notes, however, I can't actually see where they are, but you'll notice that as I move the mouse back and forth down the timeline, that note is changing color from yellow to red. So how do we now get in and see these notes? What I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate right up here to this little S that's here, and I'm going to select the keyframe navigation type. Now because I'd like to navigate by notes, I'm going to select Note Navigation. As soon as I do, take a look at what's now happened to our shot. Right here and right here is where the yellow note and the red notes have been added. And what I can now do is hold Command on the Mac, Control on Windows, and use the left and right arrow keys to jump back and forth between notes on this particular shot. Very, very handy. Now, one other thing that I do want to mention is I'm just going to jump back into the construct window. We're just going to make sure that we have this shot selected. We're going to clear our notes. Let's just delete them all here. There we go. And what I want to mention now is the fact that there is another way to add notes to shots. And I was using the keyboard shortcut, but what you also have the ability to do is to come up here to what looks like a little page scroll right here in the upper right-hand corner. You can simply click on it and type in whatever note you want to type in, and you'll be all set to go. All right, so let's come down. Let's close this project again. I'm going to come back to my system settings here. Let's talk about custom commands. Now, if you remember back to when you installed Scratch version 9.1, a little window popped up that said, would you like to install the ability to round trip between After Effects or Nuke and assimilate Scratch? Well, those were custom commands that you were setting up inside of Scratch. Now, I'm not going to go too in-depth in this lesson into that because we're going to dedicate a lesson outside of this course specifically to that workflow. But not only do you have the ability to get in and to do After Effects as well as Nuke round trips, you also have the ability to get in and launch application as well as launching post-render apps as well, right here from within the custom commands window. Now, last but certainly not least, the advanced window. Now you'll notice that there's a lot of advanced commands in here, but there's one that I do want to point out specifically. Now you'll notice here that a couple of them are highlighted. One specifically that I've actually turned on, that I make sure that's turned on in my system settings by default, which is to update the clip and reel ID with the name on load. So what does that mean? What's important to keep in mind is that especially in an Avid Dailies workflow, one piece of information that's exceptionally important inside of the Avid is tape name, because it's something that's very difficult to erase. Now you can erase it, but like I said, it's very difficult to. What would happen is that if I didn't have this set and we went through our entire workflow, let's say hypothetically, inside of Scratch, I renamed a clip called, Scene 5, Take 2. Okay, so that's the name of the clip, Scene 5, Take 2. Well, the original name of the clip might be 00001. However, when it gets sent to Avid Media Composer, there's going to be no tape ID or no clip ID. Media Composer is not going to have any tape information, and it's just going to think that the clip is called Scene 8, Take 4. When I have this option turned on, what's going to happen is that anytime I bring a clip into Scratch, it's immediately going to take the clip name and it's going to assign it to the reel ID. In this case, when that's transferred to Media Composer, that reel ID becomes the tape name, which again, like I said, is exceptionally hard to delete. So this is a fantastic workflow enhancement, especially for Media Composer workflows, where you can make sure that all of the required metadata gets sent over to the editor. So this way there's no problems when you're sending the timeline back to Scratch to do your final online. All right, I'm just going to say okay. What I'm now going to do is just jump into my user settings very quickly to show you that you do have the ability to get in and create multiple user profiles right here for when you have multiple editors or conformists working on the same system. And last but not least, you'll notice down here at the bottom we have something called our snapshot settings. I'm going to talk about snapshots in an upcoming lesson, but I just want to point out the fact that right now the snapshots are set to be JPEGs, and the location they're going to is the project's media folder, and once you take a snapshot, it will load them in the tray. Now we know that the project's media folder for what we just created is right here. So this is where those snapshots are going to go to. And inside of Scratch, if we enter the project, there we go, I'm just going to come to my timeline here, we can actually take snapshots by simply clicking the snapshot button right up here at the top. What I can now do is simply come down, click on trays, and there's the snapshot that I just took. All right, that's a lot of information to handle in one lesson, but I think it was necessary for us to get in and cover all of these bases, especially in the order that we did, so that you have the foundation to now get in and to start your Dailies workflow. All right, coming up in our next lesson, we're going to load footage, but talk more specifically about the media browser that I teased in the first lesson. We're also going to talk about the grade tab, as well as the audio, the node tab, and the metadata tab. All right, now as always, if you have any questions, you have any comments, or ideas for upcoming lessons or courses, I want you to head on over and post them in our forums at lowpost.com/forums. And if you have any questions for me, you can always send them to kevinpmcauliffe@gmail.com.